I looked my husband straight in the eyes and warned him that if his mother brought up my salary one more time, I would publicly destroy her illusion of wealth. I thought he was on my side. I was wrong. By the time the turkey was carved, I realized I was not sitting at a family dinner. I was sitting at a robbery. My name is Nadine. I am 34 years old, and as a vice president of healthcare analytics, I am used to dealing with corporate parasites. I just never expected to find the worst ones sitting at my own dining table. My childhood was not easy, and I worked incredibly hard to pull myself up from nothing to build a life of financial security. I thought marrying into a seemingly perfect family would bring me the warmth I always craved. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace. Thanksgiving was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, the plates were barely cleared before my mother-in-law, Patricia, cleared her throat and tapped her wine glass. She adjusted her designer scarf and looked across the table at me. "Nadine, Gavin tells me your bonus is coming up soon," she began with false sweetness. "We decided the best thing you can do for this family is invest $150,000 into Terrence's tech startup." My sister-in-law Madison chimed in immediately. "Come on, Nadine. Just because you crunch numbers for a hospital does not mean you understand real entrepreneurship like Terrence does. He is building an empire. You should be grateful for the rare opportunity to get in early." I did not raise my voice or break eye contact. I calmly placed my napkin on the table. Terrence, my brother-in-law, sat across from me looking smug. He wore a brand new Rolex and a custom suit, projecting the image of a successful chief executive. But numbers do not care about tailored suits. "An Empire, Madison?" I asked, keeping my tone level. "Terrence, your application is a crypto aggregator with zero proprietary code. Your user acquisition cost outstrips your projected lifetime customer value by 4 to 1. You have no patent, no revenue stream, and your burn rate means you will be bankrupt by March. I am an analyst. I do not fund vanity projects." The room went silent. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. Gavin, my husband of 3 years, shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at me. As a struggling real estate agent who had not closed a deal in 6 months, Gavin relied heavily on my income to play the big shot. He hated when I reminded them who actually paid the mortgage. Terrence let out a forced laugh. He adjusted his cuff to make sure his Rolex caught the light. "You just do not see the vision, Nadine. Tech moves fast. Some people are built for the corporate grind, not the innovator's life." He smiled, but his dark eyes were furious. He hated me because I saw right through his smooth-talking facade. Patricia glared at me, her voice shaking. "You are too selfish, Nadine." "Gavin, I cannot believe you let your wife speak to your family this way. Handle her right now." Gavin weakly muttered an apology to his mother instead of defending me. That was all the confirmation I needed. I excused myself, claiming I needed to check on dessert. I walked straight down the hallway to my home office and locked the door behind me. My heart pounded, a strange intuition gnawing at my mind. Gavin had been acting nervous all week. He was overly defensive about the mail and secretive about his laptop. I sat at my desk and opened my personal computer. I logged into my high-yield savings account, the place where I kept my emergency fund and bonuses. The screen loaded. I blinked hard, staring at the numbers, waiting for my brain to process what I was seeing. The available balance was exactly 0. I refreshed the page, it still read 0. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit as I clicked on the recent transactions tab. There it was, processed just 2 hours before dinner started. A certified cashier's check had been issued for exactly $150,000. The listed payee was Terrence Innovations, and the authorizing signature belonged to the only other joint account holder. The man I vowed to spend my life with had stolen my hard-earned money right out from under me. My husband, Gavin. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up. The initial shock had passed, and in its place was a freezing clinical clarity. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. In my line of work, when you find a critical error in the data, You do not panic. You isolate the anomaly and you eliminate it. Gavin was the anomaly. I unlocked the office door and stepped out into the hallway. The sounds of clinking silverware and laughter echoed from the dining room, where my in-laws were enjoying the feast I had paid for. Gavin was pacing near the staircase holding a half-empty glass of bourbon. When he saw me, he quickly pasted on his practiced, charming smile. "Everything okay in there?" he asked, taking a sip of his drink. "You missed the pumpkin pie." I walked right up to him, stopping just inches away. I looked at his perfectly styled hair and his expensive shoes that I had bought him for his birthday. "Where is the $150,000, Gavin?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. He rolled his eyes and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He reached out to touch my shoulder, but I stepped back. "Nadine, you are being paranoid," he said, shaking his head. "I told you the banking application has been glitching all day. They are doing system maintenance. It is probably just a display error. You really need to stop obsessing over your accounts and come spend time with the family." He thought I was stupid. He really believed he could gaslight a woman who managed billion-dollar hospital budgets for a living. I did not say another word to him. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket, dialed the priority number for my bank's fraud department, and put the device on speakerphone. "What are you doing?" Gavin hissed, his charming smile instantly vanishing. "Put that away. You are going to make a scene." I held up a finger, demanding his silence. After 2 rings, a customer service representative answered. "Hello. This is the Priority Fraud Division. My name is Agent Miller. How can I help you tonight?" "Hello, Agent Miller?" I said, keeping my eyes locked on Gavin. "I am calling to report an unauthorized withdrawal of $150,000 from my high-yield savings account." Gavin reached for my phone, but I stepped out of his grasp. He looked toward the dining room, suddenly terrified that his family would hear. "I can certainly look into that for you, ma'am," the agent said. "Can I please get you to verify your security phrase?" I provided the phrase. I heard the sound of typing on the other end of the line. The tension in the hallway was suffocating. Gavin was clenching his jaw, his face turning a dark shade of red. "Okay, I have your account pulled up here," the agent continued. "I am looking at the transaction in question." "Ma'am, this was not an unauthorized digital transfer. The funds were withdrawn in person this afternoon at the downtown branch. A certified cashier's check was issued to a business entity named Terrence Innovations LLC. I watched Gavin's chest rise and fall rapidly. I pressed the phone closer to him. "And who authorized this in-person withdrawal?" I asked smoothly. "The authorizing signature belongs to the joint account holder, Gavin," the agent replied. "We have a copy of his driver's license scan from the transaction. Everything was processed legally since he has equal access to the funds. Is there anything else I can assist you with today?" "No, that will be all," I said. "Thank you for your time." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence between us was heavy and toxic. The pathetic gaslighting act was over. I waited for him to apologize or to beg for forgiveness, but he did not. Instead, his posture changed. He puffed out his chest and looked at me with pure resentment. "I am the man of this house," he snapped, his voice a harsh whisper. "I am your husband. I have the legal and moral right to manage our assets as I see fit. You have been hoarding that money while my sister and Terrence are struggling to get their business off the ground." "Hoarding that money?" I repeated flatly. "I earned that money, Gavin. I work 60 hours a week while you sit on the couch complaining about the real estate market." "It does not matter who earned it," he interrupted, taking a step toward me. "When we got married, your money became our money. My family needed support, and you were being entirely too selfish to see the bigger picture." I stepped up and made an executive decision. I put my foot down. "Madison is my sister, and I will not watch her struggle just so you can hoard cash in a savings account." He was trying to intimidate me by using his physical presence, but I felt nothing but disgust. He had drained my account to play the wealthy savior for his entitled family. Just then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from Patricia. She must have known what Gavin did. She must have orchestrated the entire thing before they even sat down at my table. I opened the message. It read, "Glad Gavin finally put his foot down. Family comes first. Learn to be a supportive wife." I stared at the glowing words, and a terrifying calmness washed over my entire body. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I stared at the glowing words on my phone screen. Patricia had just handed me the missing puzzle piece. This was not a moment of weakness from Gavin. This was a coordinated attack by his entire family. They had sat around that dinner table, eating the food I bought, drinking the wine I selected, all while knowing they had just robbed me blind. Gavin was watching me closely. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for the hysterical wife trope, so he could justify his actions, so he could tell his mother that I was out of control and needed to be managed. I did not give him the satisfaction. I slowly lowered my phone and looked up at him. I let a cold, dead smile stretch across my face. I could see the confusion flicker in his eyes. He stepped back instinctively. "You are right, Gavin," I said, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any emotion. "We should not ruin Thanksgiving. We will talk tomorrow." Before he could formulate a response, I turned on my heel and walked past him. I did not go back to the dining room. I walked straight up the stairs and down the hall to the guest bedroom. I stepped inside, shut the heavy wooden door, and firmly slid the deadbolt into place. I heard his footsteps pause at the top of the stairs, and then slowly retreat back down to his family. He thought he had won. He thought my silence was submission. He had no idea that my silence was the sound of his entire world ending. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream into a pillow. As a data analyst, I knew that emotions cloud judgment, and right now I needed absolute precision. I walked over to the desk in the corner of the room, opened my laptop, and connected to my private cellular hotspot, bypassing the house network. If Gavin thought he was smart enough to steal from me, I had to assume he might be monitoring the internet traffic. I opened a secure browser and began my search. I did not want an amicable mediator. I wanted a legal assassin. Within 20 minutes, I found Corinne Reynolds. She was widely known as the most ruthless high-net-worth divorce attorney in Atlanta. Her firm specialized in asset recovery and financial fraud within marriages. I drafted an email detailing the exact timeline of the unauthorized withdrawal, my status as the primary breadwinner, and my intention to sever all ties immediately. I flagged the email as urgent and hit send. No warnings, no second chances. My marriage was effectively over the moment that bank teller handed Gavin my money, but a divorce attorney was only half of the equation. I needed to know exactly where my money went, and I needed to know if Gavin had compromised any of my other assets. I reached out to a contact I had used during a massive corporate audit at the hospital. Harrison Cole was a forensic accountant who tracked missing millions for a living. I sent him a secure message outlining the situation. I authorized a $10,000 emergency retainer using a private credit card Gavin did not know existed. Harrison replied within 5 minutes. He told me to upload every piece of financial data I had access to. I spent the next 4 hours pulling digital records. I downloaded joint tax returns, mortgage statements, credit reports, and the operating agreements for Terrence's supposedly revolutionary tech company. I packaged it all into an encrypted file and sent it directly to Harrison's secure server. Then I waited. The house grew completely quiet as the guests finally left and Gavin went to sleep in our master bedroom. He did not even bother knocking on the guest room door. He was probably exhausted from playing the wealthy benefactor all night. I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker in the cold November wind. I thought about the 3 years I had spent supporting him. I thought about the times I had paid off his credit cards when his real estate commissions dried up. I had built a comfortable life for us, and he had repaid me by treating my career like his personal ATM. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked over to 3 in the morning. A sharp ping echoed from my laptop speakers. It was a high-priority email from Harrison Cole. The subject line simply read, "Urgent financial discrepancies found." I opened the message and began to read the preliminary report. My eyes scanned the lines of data, and the cold analytical wall I had built around myself suddenly cracked. The $150,000 cash withdrawal was not the main event. It was just a distraction. Harrison had dug into the deep public records and pulled our property deed. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. The stolen cash was just the tip of the iceberg. I clicked the attachment and expanded the PDF document on my screen. The first page highlighted a massive liability I knew nothing about. According to public county records and the attached banking details, Gavin had recently taken out a home equity line of credit against our marital home. The amount was staggering, $400,000. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. I had purchased this house entirely with my own down payment before we even got married. But because I added him to the deed as a gesture of trust, he had the leverage to borrow against it. A loan of that size, however, required both homeowners to sign. I frantically scrolled down to the appended loan application. There at the bottom of the digital contract was my electronic signature. It was time-stamped exactly 2 weeks ago, a weekend when I was in Chicago for a medical analytics conference. He had logged into my secure email, bypassed the two-factor authentication, using my backup device left at home, and blatantly forged my consent. He had literally mortgaged my future behind my back. I kept reading Harrison's brilliant analysis to see exactly where the massive sum of money had gone. The report tracked the $400,000 moving from the equity line straight into a holding account and then wired directly to a real estate title company in the affluent Atlanta suburbs. Harrison had already pulled the property records for the destination address. It was a sprawling 5-bedroom mini mansion located in a highly exclusive gated community. And the sole name listed on the newly minted deed was Terrence. My vision blurred with sheer rage. Gavin had not just siphoned my hard-earned savings to play the big shot. He had secretly saddled me with nearly $500,000 of debt just to buy a luxury estate for his spoiled sister and her fake entrepreneur boyfriend. While Gavin was pretending to be the supportive older brother, he was funding their lavish lifestyle using the bricks and mortar of my own house. He was allowing Terrence to parade around the city as a self-made tech founder, while I unknowingly financed his entire phony existence. The audacity was so profound it almost felt fictional. Madison had the nerve to mock my corporate job at the dinner table while standing in shoes bought with the equity of my home. The digital records staring back at me were cold, hard facts. I stayed awake for the rest of the night compiling every single document into a secure cloud folder for my attorney. I categorized the fraudulent loan documents, the internet protocol addresses, showing the login from our home network during my business trip, and the wire transfer receipts. By the time the sun began to rise over the quiet neighborhood, I was not the same woman who had sat down for Thanksgiving dinner the night before. I was a weapon loaded with undeniable proof. I showered quickly and dressed in my sharpest suit. I heard Gavin moving around in the master bedroom getting ready for his supposedly busy day of doing absolutely nothing at the real estate brokerage. I quietly packed my laptop and headed downstairs, making sure to grab my coat. I needed to get to my office where I could speak freely with my legal team. But as I opened the front door to leave, the postal worker was just walking up the driveway. He held a thick, stiff envelope in his hand and a small electronic device. "Certified delivery for Nadine," he said, holding out the scanner. "I need a signature for this one." I signed the screen and took the heavy envelope. The return address in the top left corner made my blood run completely cold. It was from the Department of the Treasury Internal Revenue Service. I tore open the seal right there on the front porch, the cold morning wind biting at my face, and pulled out the crisp, formal documents. It was an official notice of an impending federal audit and a criminal investigation. Terrence's supposedly revolutionary tech company was being actively investigated for suspected wire fraud and massive tax evasion. But that was not the part that made my hands shake. According to the documents from the Internal Revenue Service, my name and my social security number were listed as the primary financial backers of the fraudulent enterprise because the initial seed money and the subsequent massive cash injections all originated from accounts tied directly to me. Gavin had not just stolen my money and my home equity to play hero for his family, he had inadvertently tied me to a massive federal crime. I folded the crisp government document and slid it into my leather briefcase. The cold morning wind whipped across the porch, but I did not feel it. My entire body was vibrating with a dangerous new energy. Gavin had not just crossed a line in our marriage. He had dragged me into a federal crime. If I confronted him now, he would panic. He might try to destroy evidence or drain the rest of our joint checking account to hire a criminal defense lawyer. I could not let that happen. I needed him to feel safe. I needed him to feel like he was completely in control. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapels of my suit, and walked back inside the house. I headed straight to the kitchen and began grinding Gavin's favorite dark roast coffee beans. The smell of brewing coffee filled the room, masking the scent of betrayal that seemed to linger in the air. A few minutes later, I heard his heavy footsteps coming down the wooden stairs. He walked into the kitchen wearing his silk robe, looking defensive and ready for another fight. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice soft and deliberately gentle. I poured the coffee into his favorite mug and slid it across the granite island toward him. He looked at the mug and then looked at me, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What is this?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Are we going to have another screaming match before I even get to the office?" I looked down at the floor, playing the part of the chastised wife perfectly. "No, Gavin," I said, letting a fake sigh escape my lips. "I stayed up all night thinking about what you said. You were right. I have been too focused on my career and my own bank accounts. I forgot that marriage is a partnership. I forgot that family comes first. I am sorry for overreacting last night. It was just a shock, but I understand why you did what you had to do to help Terrence and Madison." The transformation on his face was almost comical. His defensive posture melted away instantly, replaced by a sickeningly arrogant smirk. He picked up the coffee mug and took a slow sip, puffing his chest out. "I am glad you finally came to your senses, Nadine," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I knew you just needed time to cool off and see the bigger picture. I am the man of this house, and I need you to trust my financial instincts. Terrence is going to make us all very wealthy soon. You will thank me later." I smiled weakly and nodded. "Of course, Gavin. I trust you." He was so thrilled with his victory that he pulled his phone from his pocket and immediately dialed his mother. He did not even bother to leave the room. He put Patricia on speakerphone, letting the call ring through the quiet kitchen. "Good morning, Mom," Gavin announced brightly. "Just wanted to let you know that everything is sorted out here. Nadine and I had a long talk, and she completely understands the investment we made in Terrence's company. She even apologized for her behavior at dinner." Patricia's shrill voice echoed from the tiny speaker. "Oh, thank goodness, Gavin. I told you that you just needed to be firm with her. Women like her get so caught up in their little corporate jobs that they forget their actual place in the family hierarchy. You are a good husband for guiding her back to reality." I stood there wiping down the pristine kitchen counters, listening to them tear down my character and praise his blatant theft. Every word they spoke was a nail in their own coffin. After Gavin went upstairs to shower, I sat at the kitchen island and opened my phone. I tapped on the social media application and navigated to Madison's profile. She had just uploaded a new video. It was a 3-minute tour of the massive 5-bedroom suburban mansion that my stolen home equity had secretly purchased. Madison was walking through a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase, holding a designer coffee cup and beaming at the camera. "Welcome to our new dream home," she squealed into the microphone. "Terrence has been working so hard on his tech company, and it is finally paying off. God is so good. And to all the selfish, toxic family members who tried to hold us back and said we would never succeed, well, look at us now. Protect your peace, guys, and cut off the haters." She twirled around to show off a massive crystal chandelier. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly focused. I tapped the screen record button, capturing every single frame of her flaunting the fruits of federal wire fraud. Corinne, my divorce attorney, was going to have an absolute field day with this footage. I saved the video to my encrypted secure folder alongside the bank statements and the forged loan documents. Just as I was packing my briefcase to leave for the office, Gavin came back downstairs. He was dressed in his sharpest suit, holding a manila folder. He walked over to me and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in dense legal jargon. "Hey babe, before you head to work, I need a quick favor," he said casually, holding out a pen. Terrence's accountant found a tiny clerical error in his tax filings for the startup. Since the initial seed money came from our joint account, the accountant just needs you to sign this routine tax document to clear things up. It is just standard paperwork to keep the federal auditors off his back. Just sign right here on the dotted line. I stared at the pen in his hand, and then at the document that could potentially send me to federal prison. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I tapped my watch and let out a frustrated sigh, playing my part to absolute perfection. I told Gavin I was running incredibly late for a massive data analytics review with the hospital board and simply could not focus on reading legal jargon right now. I snatched the document from his hand and slid it into my leather briefcase. I promised him I would review it on my lunch break, sign it, and bring it back to him that evening. He rolled his eyes at my corporate dedication, muttering something about how my job always got in the way of family business, but he let it go. He reminded me not to forget because Terrence was under a lot of pressure. I walked out the front door, got into my car, and drove straight past the hospital. I headed downtown and parked in the underground garage of a sleek glass high-rise. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Corinne Reynolds, the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city. I pulled the document from my briefcase and slid it across her massive desk. Corinne put on her designer glasses and read through the dense paragraphs. A cold, predatory smile slowly spread across her face. She explained exactly what Terrence and his shady accountant were attempting to do. The paper was an affidavit of financial responsibility. By signing it, I would be formally acknowledging the stolen $150,000 as my intentional personal investment into the fraudulent startup. It was a legal shield designed to protect Terrence from the Internal Revenue Service by throwing me directly into the line of federal fire. If I had blindly signed that piece of paper, I would have taken the fall for their entire money laundering operation. I leaned forward in my chair and asked Corinne if we could turn the weapon back on them. She pressed an intercom button on her desk and summoned her senior paralegal. For the next 2 hours, we sat in that pristine office and completely reverse-engineered the trap. Corinne's team drafted a visually identical document. They matched the exact weight of the paper, the identical font sizing, the margin spacing, and the exact letterhead of Terrence's accounting firm. To a casual observer, the new document looked completely unchanged, but the dense block of legal text in the third paragraph was entirely rewritten. The new clause was a masterpiece of legal destruction. It explicitly stated that Gavin, acting as the primary investor, formally assumed the role of sole individual guarantor for Terrence Innovations. It legally bound him to accept full personal liability for all corporate debts, tax penalties, and civil judgments, past, present, and future. Most importantly, it contained an ironclad indemnification clause clearing me of any and all financial involvement or knowledge of the company operations. I left the law firm with the perfect weapon neatly tucked into my briefcase. I went to work, finished my analytics reports, and drove home exactly at 6 o'clock, playing the role of the exhausted corporate wife. When I walked into the living room, the house was dark except for the glaring light of the television. Gavin was sprawled out on the expensive leather sofa I had purchased with my first major promotion. He held a cold beer in one hand and had his eyes glued to a Monday night football game. The volume was turned up loud. I casually dropped my keys on the console table and walked over to him. I pulled the newly drafted document from my bag, along with a sleek black pen. I stood between him and the television screen, just enough to be a slight annoyance. "Hey, I looked over the paperwork with my legal compliance team at work just to be safe, I said, keeping my tone light and entirely dismissive. It turns out the accountant drafted it wrong. Since you were the one who physically authorized the cashier's check at the bank branch, your signature needs to be the primary one on the affidavit, not mine. They just need you to sign right here at the bottom to verify the chain of custody. Gavin let out a loud groan of frustration, shifting aggressively on the couch to look around my waist at the television screen. A player had just intercepted the ball and the virtual crowd was going wild. He was incredibly eager to get back to his game and utterly arrogant in his belief that I was too submissive to ever challenge him. He snatched the pen from my hand. He did not read the first sentence. He did not scan the middle paragraphs to see the new liability clause. He simply scribbled his name across the bottom line. By trying to rush me out of the way of his football game, Gavin had just legally anchored himself to a sinking ship of federal tax fraud and handed it right back to me. I pulled the signed document from Gavin's hand before the ink was even fully dry. I carefully slid it back into my briefcase and locked the brass clasps. He did not even look away from the television screen. He let out a loud cheer as his team scored, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. With Gavin and Terrence now legally bound together in a sinking ship of federal tax evasion, it was time to address the root of the problem. My mother-in-law, Patricia. Patricia was the architect of my misery. She was the one who constantly belittled my career while openly demanding the fruits of my labor. I walked upstairs to the guest room, locked the door, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the secure digital folder that Harrison Cole, the forensic accountant, had sent me. Harrison had been thorough, running deep background financial checks on all immediate family members just to be safe. I clicked on the subfolder labeled with Patricia's name. Patricia loved to play the role of the wealthy matriarch. She wore vintage designer clothes to church, hosted lavish garden parties, and constantly bragged to anyone who would listen about her highly exclusive country club membership. She looked down on me because I actually worked for my money instead of inheriting it. But as I scrolled through the pages of public tax records, property liens, and credit reports, the glittering illusion of her old money status completely shattered. Patricia was completely broke. She was not just cash poor, she was drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Her pristine colonial home, the absolute crown jewel of her social status and personal identity, was mortgaged to the hilt. The documents showed she had taken out multiple high-interest loans against the property just to maintain her wealthy lifestyle after Gavin's father passed away. And according to the county clerk's recorded documents, she had not made a single mortgage payment in over 4 months. She was exactly 120 days delinquent. The regional bank holding her mortgage had already filed a formal public notice of default. She was quite literally weeks away from total foreclosure and public humiliation. Suddenly, the Thanksgiving ambush made perfect sense. She did not just want my $150,000 to fund Terrence's fake tech empire. She desperately needed to funnel my money through his company to quietly pay off her own massive debts and save her precious house. She was entirely willing to destroy my financial future just to protect her fragile country club facade. A normal person might have just stepped back, let the bank take the house, and watched her fall from grace. But I was an executive data analyst. I specialized in recognizing highly leveraged assets and executing hostile acquisitions. I did not just want Patricia to lose her home. I wanted absolute control over her downfall. I wanted to be the one holding the keys when the locks were finally changed. Early the next morning, I made a highly specialized phone call to a corporate attorney based in Delaware. Delaware is notorious for its strict corporate secrecy laws, allowing individuals to form business entities with absolute anonymity. Within hours, and for a nominal expedited filing fee, I became the sole owner of a brand new shell company. The corporation had a generic name, a registered agent, and absolutely no public paper trail leading back to me. I immediately contacted the commercial debt restructuring department of the regional bank that held Patricia's mortgage. Banks despise carrying non-performing loans on their books, especially heading into the end of the fiscal year. They much prefer to sell bad debt to private investment firms for a guaranteed lump sum of cash. I quickly liquidated a portion of my vested corporate stock options from the hospital and wired the funds directly through my new anonymous Delaware entity. I offered the bank a clean, fast cash buyout for Patricia's defaulted mortgage. The bank executives did not ask questions. They were just thrilled to get the toxic asset off their balance sheets. By Friday afternoon, the final electronic confirmation hit my secure inbox. The deed of trust had been officially reassigned to my holding company. The regional bank was no longer Patricia's problem. I stared at the digital certificate glowing on my computer screen, a cold smile spreading across my face. Patricia still thought she was the untouchable matriarch of a wealthy suburban dynasty. She still thought she could steal from me and command my obedience. She had no idea that her daughter-in-law, the woman she relentlessly mocked for working a corporate job, had just bought her debt entirely in cash. I was now legally her landlord and her ultimate debt holder, and her grace period had just expired. The weekend arrived with a heavy envelope waiting in our mailbox. The thick cream-colored cardstock was embossed with glittering gold foil. It was a formal invitation to a combined housewarming and engagement party for Madison and Terrence. The address, printed in elegant cursive, was the exact 5-bedroom suburban mansion that Gavin had secretly purchased using my forged home equity line of credit. They were throwing a massive celebration to show off the fruits of their federal wire fraud, and they had the sheer audacity to invite me to the crime scene. Gavin came home later that evening holding his own copy of the invitation, acting like a proud patriarch. He tossed the gold foil envelope onto the kitchen counter and beamed. He boasted about how proud he was of Madison and how Terrence's tech company was clearly booming if they could afford to host such a lavish event. He looked me right in the eye and said it just goes to show what happens when a family supports each other. He had completely compartmentalized his own crimes. He truly believed he was a generous benefactor instead of a desperate thief who had mortgaged his wife's house behind her back. I simply smiled at him and said I was looking forward to seeing their new home. Later that afternoon, while Gavin was out playing golf, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Patricia's name. I accepted the call and put it on speakerphone while I sorted through my hospital analytics reports. Patricia did not bother with a polite greeting. She launched straight into her demands. "Nadine, I hope you received the invitation," she began, her tone dripping with false authority. "Since Terrence and Madison are so busy preparing for their big day, we have decided that you will be handling the catering. We are expecting around 100 guests from the country club and Terrence's private investor circle." I paused my typing and stared at the phone. "You want me to cater a party for 100 people?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Patricia huffed dramatically into the receiver. "Yes, Nadine. You embarrassed this family deeply at Thanksgiving with your little outburst about Terrence's business model. This is the perfect opportunity for you to make up for your poor attitude and show some actual support. I expect a full spread of hors d'oeuvres, a prime rib carving station, bacon-wrapped scallops, and a luxury dessert bar. And do not try to bill Gavin for the groceries. Consider this your financial contribution to the family you so selfishly neglected." A few days ago, a demand like this would have sent me into a blind rage. But sitting there holding the digital deed to her heavily defaulted mortgage, I felt nothing but pure amusement. Patricia was standing on the deck of the sinking Titanic demanding I serve her vintage champagne. I smiled at the wall. "Of course, Patricia," I replied cheerfully. "I completely understand. I will take care of everything for the party. You will not have to worry about a single detail. It will be an evening no one will ever forget." Patricia sounded slightly taken aback by my sudden compliance, but quickly recovered her usual arrogance. "Good. See that you do. Wear something appropriate for a change. We have very important investors coming, and I will not have you looking like a tired corporate drone in front of them." She disconnected the call without another word. I set my phone down and immediately pulled up my contact list. I did not search for local catering companies or event planners. I had zero intention of standing behind a carving station serving roast beef to a bunch of grifters and country club snobs. Instead, I called Corinne, my divorce attorney. I told her the date and the exact location of the engagement party. Corinne let out a sharp laugh over the phone. A housewarming party at a property bought with stolen funds, while the federal government is actively auditing the buyer, she said. They are practically begging for a federal raid, Nadine. We have all the documents ready to go. I instructed Corinne to finalize the divorce petition and the civil lawsuit for federal bank fraud. Then I made 2 more phone calls. The first was to a highly reviewed private security firm that specialized in high-conflict asset protection. I hired 2 large men in plain clothes to attend the party and secure the perimeter. The second call was to a licensed process server known for his ironclad delivery methods. I booked him for the night of the party and gave him physical descriptions of Gavin and Terrence. I was not going to bring trays of appetizers or a dessert bar to Madison's grand suburban mansion. I was bringing the absolute full weight of the American legal system. The morning of the party arrived with Gavin strutting around our house like he had just conquered the world. He was dressed in casual designer clothes, acting as though he was the chief executive of his own life instead of an unemployed real estate agent. I was quietly sipping my coffee when he walked into the kitchen and slapped his hands down on the marble counter. "Get your purse, Nadine," he ordered with a smug grin on his face. "We need to go shopping. We cannot show up to Madison's massive engagement party empty-handed. We need a gift that reflects our social standing and shows them we are fully on board with Terrence's vision." I set my coffee mug down and followed him out to his car, playing the role of the obedient wife to absolute perfection. He drove us straight to a high-end luxury appliance boutique in the most expensive shopping district of the city. The moment we walked through the glass doors, Gavin puffed out his chest, acting like he owned the entire building. He bypassed the standard kitchen items and walked directly to a display of imported Italian espresso machines. He ran his hand over the gleaming chrome of a massive commercial-grade unit. "This is the one," he announced loudly, making sure the nearby sales associate could hear him. "Terrence loves his premium coffee. This will look perfect in their new suburban mansion." I looked at the small silver price tag resting next to the machine. It was exactly $5,000. I turned to Gavin, keeping my expression entirely blank. "That is a very generous gift, Gavin," I said softly. He scoffed and crossed his arms. "Do not be cheap, Nadine. They are family. Besides, my capital is currently tied up in some commercial real estate investments, so you are going to put this on your personal credit card. Consider it an apology for your lack of faith in Terrence at Thanksgiving. Show me you are actually a team player for once." He looked at me with a challenging glare, daring me to argue with him in the middle of a luxury boutique. The sales associate walked over, smiling brightly, and asked if we were ready to check out. Gavin gestured toward me like a king directing his servant. "My wife will be handling the payment today," he said smoothly. I did not argue. I did not roll my eyes. I simply opened my designer wallet and pulled out a sleek silver credit card, handing it directly to the cashier. Gavin smirked, looking incredibly satisfied with his ability to command my finances. He truly believed he had completely broken my spirit. What Gavin did not know was that the specific silver card I handed over was tied to an account I had heavily monitored. Late last night, I had already contacted the issuing bank and reported the card as potentially compromised. I had instructed the fraud department to place a hard lock and reverse all unverified weekend transactions exactly at midnight. The $5,000 charge would temporarily clear the store's payment terminal today, allowing us to walk out with the massive box. But by tomorrow morning, the bank would automatically bounce the payment entirely. The fraud department would flag the transaction, and the boutique would immediately send a collection notice and a demand for the return of the stolen merchandise directly to Madison's new home address. Gavin wanted to give them an expensive gift to boost his own ego. I was giving them a police report. We loaded the heavy espresso machine into the trunk of the car and drove back to our house. Gavin spent the entire ride bragging about how impressed Terrence was going to be and how this gift would solidify his position as the supportive patriarch of the family. I just watched the city streets roll by, waiting patiently for the sun to go down. When we got home, I went straight up to my home office to get dressed for the party. I locked the door behind me and walked over to my desk. Before doing my makeup, I opened my secure laptop to check for any final updates from Corinne. Instead, I found a highly classified encrypted email from Harrison Cole, my forensic accountant. The subject line was marked with a red urgent flag. I opened the message and read through the newly attached financial documents. My heart hammered against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of pure adrenaline. Harrison had dug far past the surface-level tax evasion. He had gained access to Terrence's corporate banking ledgers through a digital backdoor. The truth was far more sinister than a failing tech application. Terrence Innovations did not have a single line of working code. There was no product. Terrence was running a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He was actively using the cash from new investors like the $150,000 Gavin stole from me to pay fake dividends to his early investors. The Internal Revenue Service audit was just the initial trigger. Harrison confirmed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already stepped in and taken over the case. Terrence was not just facing financial penalties anymore. He was facing decades in federal prison. And according to Harrison's inside source, the feds were not waiting for Monday morning. The arrest warrants had been signed by a federal judge an hour ago. The authorities were closing in fast, and they knew exactly where Terrence would be celebrating tonight. I closed the encrypted email from Harrison and let out a long, slow breath. The stakes had just escalated from civil fraud to federal prison. Terrence was not just a grifter, he was a criminal mastermind who had run out of time. And Gavin had happily chained himself to the sinking ship just to impress his mother. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was going to raid the engagement party tonight. I did not feel fear or panic. I felt an absolute freezing calm. I closed my laptop and walked into the master bathroom. Tonight was not just a party, it was an execution. And if I was going to stand in the middle of a federal raid and dismantle my husband's entire family, I was going to look absolutely flawless doing it. I spent the next hour preparing myself with the meticulous precision of a soldier suiting up for battle. I applied my makeup perfectly, ensuring my foundation was matte and my eyeliner was razor sharp. There would be no tears tonight. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, polished style that screamed corporate executive. I walked into my walk-in closet and bypassed the soft pastel dresses Patricia usually demanded I wear to her country club events. Instead, I pulled out a tailored emerald green silk dress that fit me like armor. I paired it with my sharpest black stiletto heels. Just as I was fastening a simple gold necklace, my phone vibrated on the marble vanity. It was a secure message from Corinne, my divorce attorney. I unlocked the screen and read the brief text. All filings are officially stamped by the judge, she wrote. The divorce petition, the civil lawsuit for federal bank fraud, and the foreclosure notice for Patricia's house are fully executed and legally binding. The trap is completely set. Good luck tonight. I deleted the message and slipped the phone into my designer clutch. I walked downstairs and found Gavin waiting by the front door. He was wearing his expensive tailored suit, adjusting his silk tie in the hallway mirror. When he turned and saw me walking down the stairs, his smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He was used to seeing me exhausted from work or dressed down to avoid Patricia's relentless judgment. He was not used to seeing me look like I owned the room. "You look nice," he said, his tone slightly defensive. "Just remember not to talk too much about your corporate job tonight. Terrence has some heavy-hitting investors flying in, and we need the focus to be entirely on his tech company. We are representing the family brand." "I will not say a single word about my job, Gavin," I replied smoothly. "Tonight is all about Terrence and his investors. I promise you they will get exactly what they came for." He smiled completely, missing the double meaning of my words. We walked out to the driveway and got into his car. The drive to the wealthy suburbs took 45 minutes. Gavin spent the entire time bragging about the $5,000 espresso machine in the trunk and practicing the arrogant toast he planned to give. He talked about how Terrence's success was going to elevate the whole family and how I should be grateful that he took the initiative to invest our money when I was too short-sighted to see the potential. I just looked out the passenger window, watching the sky turn a deep bruised purple as the sun set over the city. We pulled into the exclusive gated community and drove up the winding tree-lined street. The massive 5-bedroom mansion was completely illuminated. Expensive luxury cars lined the sprawling circular driveway. I could hear the faint sound of a live jazz quartet playing in the grand foyer. It looked exactly like the kind of high society event Patricia lived for. It looked like a monument to their fake wealth built entirely on the foundation of my stolen assets and federal wire fraud. Gavin pulled the car up to the front entrance, where a team of valet drivers in crisp white shirts and black vests were waiting to take the keys. He parked the car and stepped out immediately, shouting arrogant orders to the staff about being careful with the luxury espresso machine in the trunk. I opened my own door and stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The crisp November night air hit my face. One of the valet drivers, a tall man with broad shoulders and a completely neutral expression, walked quickly around the front of the car and stopped right in front of me. He did not reach for the car door. Instead, he gave me a very subtle nod. He was not a valet driver at all. He was the private process server I had hired earlier that afternoon. "Ready when you are, ma'am?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I adjusted my clutch, looked up at the towering mansion, and smiled. Let the party begin. We walked through the massive custom mahogany doors and stepped directly into the grand foyer of the suburban mansion. The interior was an absolutely nauseating monument to stolen wealth. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting brilliant light over pristine white marble floors. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated through the heavy crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The air hummed with the sound of a live jazz quartet playing softly in the corner and the overlapping chatter of nearly 100 wealthy guests. I immediately recognized two distinct groups mingling in the room. Half of the crowd consisted of Patricia's pretentious country club friends wearing their designer gowns and judgmental expressions. The other half were Terrence's so-called investors. They were mostly older, wealthy individuals who thought they were getting in on the ground floor of a revolutionary tech company. They had no idea they were currently funding a massive Ponzi scheme. Before we could even grab a drink from a passing waiter, Patricia spotted us from across the room. She immediately broke away from a group of her wealthy friends and marched toward us. She was wearing a heavily beaded vintage gown that looked utterly ridiculous for a housewarming party, but perfectly matched her desperate need for attention. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, immediately narrowing in extreme disapproval. "Nadine, I specifically asked you to wear something appropriate for a social gathering," Patricia said, her voice projected loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "That emerald green dress is so incredibly harsh and corporate. You look like you are about to walk into a hostile board meeting. Could you not soften your appearance for just one single evening to celebrate your family?" A few of her country club friends turned their heads and let out quiet, amused chuckles. It was easily a 4-carat stone set in a thick platinum band. "Look what Terrence surprised me with before the party," she squealed, holding her hand up for Gavin to admire. "He said the tech application just secured another round of private funding, and he wanted to show me how much he appreciates my support. It is just so wonderful to be with a man who actually knows how to provide." She shot a venomous sideways glance at me, clearly intending to make me feel inadequate. I stared at the glittering diamond on her finger. I knew exactly where that round of private funding had come from. That 4-carat diamond was purchased directly with the stolen funds from my home equity line of credit. I was literally looking at my own stolen mortgage sitting on her finger. Gavin clapped his hands together, acting like a proud patriarch. "Well, we brought a little something to add to the new house," he announced loudly, signaling for one of the staff members to bring in the massive box from the front door. "We got Terrence that $5,000 Italian espresso machine he was looking at. Only the best for my sister and my new brother-in-law. Madison shrieked with delight and hugged Gavin again loudly, proclaiming him to be the best brother in the world. They were completely lost in their own arrogant delusion. I stood quietly sipping a glass of sparkling water, watching the room. I looked at the investors laughing and drinking, completely unaware that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was about to seize every single asset in this house. Suddenly, the jazz music abruptly stopped. A loud, sharp clinking sound echoed through the grand foyer. I turned to see Terence standing halfway up the sweeping marble staircase holding a crystal champagne flute and a silver spoon. He looked down at the massive crowd, flashing a bright, charismatic smile that hid the heart of a federal criminal. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Terence announced, his smooth voice projecting easily across the silent room. "Tonight is about celebrating success, vision, and the people who make it happen. I want to make a special toast to my beautiful fiancée, Madison, and to my incredibly supportive family." He paused and locked eyes directly with me and Gavin, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. "And I especially want to thank those who finally realized their place and contributed to the vision." The room erupted in polite applause as Terence finished his arrogant toast. Gavin puffed out his chest and raised his glass of champagne, taking a sip, as if the praise was meant directly for him. He looked over at me, expecting me to lower my head in submissive agreement. Terence stood halfway up the sweeping marble staircase, soaking in the admiration of the wealthy investors he was currently defrauding. Madison leaned against the banister, flashing her stolen diamond ring at anyone who looked her way. The sheer audacity of their celebration was nauseating, but I did not feel sick. I felt an exhilarating rush of absolute power. I set my glass of sparkling water down on a passing waiter's silver tray. The clink of the crystal was soft, but to me it sounded like the racking of a shotgun. I stepped out from the shadow of the archway and walked directly into the center of the grand foyer. I did not wait for the applause to fully die down. I projected my voice clear and sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the country club elite. "You are absolutely right, Terence," I announced, my words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Building a vision requires massive contribution and true sacrifice. It requires people who are willing to give everything they have to ensure the truth comes to light." The entire room went dead silent. Over 100 faces turned to look at me. Patricia gasped, dropping her hand from her pearls. She hissed my name under her breath, stepping forward to grab my arm and drag me out of sight. I sidestepped her with effortless grace, keeping my eyes locked dead on Terence. Gavin suddenly realized what was happening. His face flushed a deep shade of crimson. He rushed forward, grabbing my elbow and squeezing hard. "Nadine, what are you doing?" he muttered through gritted teeth, forcing a fake smile for the watching crowd. "You are making a scene in front of the capital investors. Go back to the corner and shut your mouth before you ruin my sister's night." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. "Let go of me, Gavin," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that only he could hear. "If you do not remove your hand, I will break your fingers in front of your mother's friends." He blinked in shock, his grip instantly loosening. He took a clumsy step backward, suddenly realizing he was not dealing with the submissive wife he thought he had trained. I turned back to the crowd, offering them a bright, devastating smile. "Please excuse the interruption," I said loudly. But as Gavin's wife, and as someone who has unknowingly funded so much of this beautiful new lifestyle, I felt it was only right that I bring a special gift for the entire family tonight to celebrate this monumental occasion. Madison let out a loud, dramatic sigh from the stairs. "Oh my God, Nadine, we already saw the espresso machine," she whined. "You do not need to make a speech to get credit for buying a coffee maker. Stop trying to make everything about you." I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes fixed on the front entrance. "I do not care about the espresso machine, Madison," I replied smoothly. "My gift is far more personal, and it guarantees that everyone in this room gets exactly what they deserve." I gave a very subtle nod toward the heavy mahogany doors. The two plainclothes security guards I had hired seamlessly shifted positions, blocking the main exit. Then the tall man wearing the crisp white shirt and the black valet vest stepped inside. He did not look like a servant. He walked with heavy, purposeful strides, his boots echoing sharply against the pristine white marble. He bypassed the confused waiters and marched straight past Patricia's wealthy friends. "Excuse me," Patricia snapped, stepping into his path. "You are supposed to be outside parking the vehicles. Who let you in here?" The man completely ignored her. He sidestepped Patricia and walked directly to the base of the sweeping staircase, where Gavin and Terence were standing frozen in confusion. The man reached inside his vest and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder sealed with red legal tape. He looked directly at my husband. "Are you Gavin?" he asked, his voice booming through the silent foyer. Gavin swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the surrounding investors. "Yes, that is me," he answered, his voice trembling slightly. The tall man shoved the heavy folder directly into Gavin's chest, forcing him to take it. "You have been served," the man announced clearly before taking a step back and folding his arms. The jazz quartet was entirely silent. Nobody dared to breathe. The wealthy investors exchanged nervous, alarmed glances, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Gavin stood there looking down at the thick legal documents resting in his hands. His arrogant posture completely collapsed. He fumbled with the clasp, tearing the red tape and pulling out the dense stack of stamped papers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "What is this?" he asked, his voice cracking. I let a cold, victorious smile spread across my face. "It is a divorce petition, Gavin," I said loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And a civil lawsuit for federal bank fraud." The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the silver champagne buckets. The live jazz quartet had completely stopped playing, leaving the musicians standing awkwardly with their instruments frozen in their hands. Gavin's face lost all its color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His hands shook so violently that the thick stack of legal documents slipped from his fingers. The heavy papers scattered across the pristine white marble floor like dead leaves. He stared down at them, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. Patricia was the first to break the suffocating silence. Her voice was shrill and bordered on absolute hysteria. "Nadine, what is wrong with you?" she screamed. Her face flushed with sudden rage. She pushed her way through a small group of investors and marched toward me. "You are completely unhinged. How dare you come into this house and make a scene in front of our esteemed guests? You are ruining Madison's engagement party with your psychotic corporate drama. Gavin has never committed a crime in his entire life." I did not raise my voice to match her frantic energy. I simply reached into my emerald green designer clutch and pulled out a sleek black envelope. "He has Patricia," I said, my voice perfectly calm and level, "and he used my home to do it." I turned my attention away from my screaming mother-in-law and looked directly at my husband, who was still staring blankly at the scattered court documents. "Did you really think I would not notice a $400,000 lien against the property I bought before we were even married, Gavin?" I asked. I opened the black envelope and pulled out a condensed printed copy of the forensic accountant's report. I held it up for him and the surrounding crowd to see. "When I was in Chicago for a medical analytics conference 2 weeks ago, you logged into my secure email account. You bypassed the two-factor authentication using the backup tablet device I left in my home office desk drawer. You initiated a massive home equity line of credit, forging my electronic signature on the federal loan application." Gavin opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just stood there, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, but even his own mother had suddenly gone quiet as the massive dollar amount registered in her mind. "You are a terrible criminal, Gavin," I continued, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent foyer. "I am an executive data analyst. Did you honestly believe you could hide a digital footprint from me? My forensic accountant pulled the network data yesterday. The Internet Protocol address attached to the forged electronic signature traces directly back to our home router at the exact minute my flight was landing in Illinois. I have the hardware identification numbers for the device you used. I also have the audio recording subpoenaed from the bank customer service line, where you explicitly verified the fraudulent transfer while pretending to have my verbal consent off camera. The wealthy investors standing around the perimeter of the room suddenly shifted uncomfortably. The polite amusement they had shown just moments ago when Patricia insulted my dress had completely vanished. Whispers began to ripple rapidly through the crowd as they realized this was not just a bitter wife throwing a dramatic tantrum. This was a highly documented clinical presentation of a major financial crime. The investors started looking back and forth between the scattered legal papers on the floor and Terrence connecting the dots between the stolen $400,000 and the massive suburban mansion they were currently standing inside. Terrence saw the panic rapidly spreading among his financial marks. He knew he was losing control of the room, and if these investors walked out, his entire Ponzi scheme would collapse before the night was over. He shoved his crystal champagne flute into Madison's hands and marched heavily down the remaining marble stairs. He squared his broad shoulders, trying to use his height and physical presence to intimidate me into silence. He stopped just inches away from my face. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched in his cheek. "Listen to me very carefully." Nadine Terrence hissed, his voice low and dripping with threat. "You are crazy, and you cannot prove a single thing you just said. My company is entirely legitimate, and this house is legally deeded entirely in my name. You have no power here. You are trespassing on my property, and I want you out right now." I looked up at Terrence, completely unfazed by his pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. He was standing close enough that I could smell the expensive cologne he had undoubtedly purchased with someone else's money. He puffed out his chest, trying to play the protective alpha male in front of his wealthy marks. But I did not see a chief executive. I saw a cornered rat who had just realized the trap had snapped shut. "You are incredibly confident for a man who does not own a single line of proprietary code, Terrence," I replied, my voice echoing clearly through the massive foyer. "You keep talking about this house being legally deeded in your name. You clearly do not understand how federal asset forfeiture works." I reached back into my emerald green clutch and pulled out the final piece of the puzzle. It was a thick packet of paper bearing the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. I did not just hold it up. I stepped forward and pressed the heavy stack of documents directly against Terrence's chest, forcing him to take it just as Gavin had taken his divorce papers. Terrence looked down at the paper. His arrogant smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer horror. "That is an official indictment from the Internal Revenue Service," I announced, turning slightly so the wealthy investors in the room could hear every single word. "My forensic accountant bypassed your corporate ledgers yesterday afternoon. You do not have a tech company, Terrence. You are running a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. You have been using the cash from new investors to pay fake dividends to your early backers. And you used my husband's stolen $400,000 home equity line of credit to purchase this very house." The grand foyer instantly erupted into chaos. The polite whispers of the country club elite turned into shouts of outrage and panic. Several of the older investors who had been praising Terrence just moments ago began pushing their way toward the front, demanding answers. They realized their money was gone. The facade of the brilliant tech entrepreneur completely shattered, leaving only a cheap con artist exposed under the bright crystal chandelier. Terrence tried to speak to defend himself, to calm the angry crowd, but his voice failed him. He just stared at the federal indictment, trembling. "You bought this house with fraudulently obtained funds, Terrence," I said, delivering the final blow with absolute precision. "Which means it is a federal crime scene. The bank is seizing it tomorrow, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation is not far behind them." Madison let out a piercing, ear-splitting shriek. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, entirely shattering the elegant atmosphere of her perfect engagement party. She dropped her crystal champagne flute onto the marble floor, where it shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. "You are lying!" she screamed, her face contorted with panic and rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me, the stolen 4-carat diamond catching the light one last time. "You are just jealous, Nadine. You have always been jealous of me and Terrence. We are wealthy. We are successful. You are just trying to ruin my perfect night because your own marriage is a massive failure. Tell them it is a lie, Terrence. Tell them she is crazy." Terrence did not look at her. He could not even meet her eyes. He was too busy reading the first page of the federal indictment, his breathing shallow and rapid. He knew it was over. Every single dollar he had stolen, every lie he had told, was meticulously documented right there in black and white. Madison grabbed Terrence's arm, shaking him violently. "Do something!" she shrieked, her carefully crafted image as the wealthy socialite completely disintegrating. "Throw her out. Call the police. Get her out of my house." When Terrence remained frozen in terrified silence, Madison spun around looking for her ultimate protector. She looked for the brother who had always bailed her out, who had always stolen and lied to ensure she got whatever she wanted. She looked for the man who had mortgaged his own future just to buy her a fake dream. "Gavin, do something!" Madison cried out, tears of frustration finally spilling over her perfectly applied makeup. "Tell her to stop. Make her fix this." But Gavin did not step forward to defend his sister. He did not yell at me or try to take control of the room. He was completely deaf to Madison's screaming. Gavin was standing near the base of the staircase, his face completely drained of blood, staring down at a specific piece of paper he had pulled from the divorce folder. It was a copy of the routine tax document he had hastily signed the night before so he could get back to watching his football game. He was reading the fine print. Gavin stood entirely frozen at the base of the sweeping marble staircase, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. His lips moved silently as he read the altered paragraph over and over again, trying to make sense of the horrifying reality printing in stark black ink. The document was no longer a shield designed to protect Terrence by using my name. It was a perfectly executed legal trap, and Gavin had walked right into it without a second thought. I watched as the realization finally hit him. The last remaining drop of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His hands shook so violently that the thick paper rattled audibly in the quiet foyer. "What did you do?" Gavin whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. "What did you make me sign?" "I did not make you sign anything, Gavin," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and carrying easily across the silent room. "You chose to sign it. You were in such a rush to get back to your football game, and so eager to exert your authority over our finances, that you did not even bother to read the fine print. You signed a legally binding affidavit, assuming full personal liability for Terrence Innovations. You are now the sole individual guarantor for all of his corporate debts, tax penalties, and civil judgments." Gavin stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. He turned his horrified gaze toward Terrence, who was still clutching the federal indictment from the Internal Revenue Service. Gavin finally connected the dots. The $400,000 he stole from my home equity was just a drop in the bucket. Terrence owed the federal government millions in unpaid taxes and fraudulent investment returns. And because of the document Gavin signed last night, the federal government was going to collect every single penny of that massive debt directly from him. "You lied to me!" Gavin screamed, the sudden explosive sound making several wealthy investors flinch. "You told me the tech company was profitable. You told me you were securing massive rounds of private funding. You said the initial seed money was just a formality to get the application off the ground." Terrence stepped back, holding his hands up defensively. His smooth, confident persona was completely shattered. "Listen, man, I did not know she changed the paperwork," Terrence stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward the exits. "We can fix this. We just need to pool our resources and hire a good defense attorney. We are in this together. We are not in anything together." Gavin roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You used my money. You used my house. You took my $400,000 and you lost all of it in a fake company. And now you expect me to take the fall for your federal tax evasion. You are going to ruin my entire life." The last thread of Gavin's manufactured composure completely snapped. He dropped the legal documents onto the marble floor, let out a primal yell of absolute rage, and lunged directly at his brother-in-law. He grabbed Terence by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and shoved him violently backward. Terence caught off guard, stumbled and crashed into a massive circular catering table positioned in the center of the grand foyer. He desperately grabbed Gavin's shirt collar, trying to regain his balance and pull Gavin down with him. The two men grappled clumsily, their desperate, undignified struggle knocking the heavy silk tablecloth askew. The movement destabilized the absolute centerpiece of the engagement party. A towering 8-tier pyramid of crystal champagne coupes swayed precariously for a fraction of a second before completely collapsing. Hundreds of expensive crystal glasses cascaded onto the marble floor in a deafening, explosive crash. A massive wave of sticky vintage champagne splashed across the pristine white tiles, soaking the cuffs of Gavin's trousers and ruining Terence's expensive leather shoes. The wealthy investors and country club elite instantly scattered, screaming and shouting in panic as shards of shattered crystal flew across the room. The elegant engagement party had rapidly devolved into a chaotic, violent brawl. Madison dropped to her knees near the staircase, sobbing hysterically over her ruined night and her impending financial doom. Patricia watched her entire world completely disintegrate before her eyes. The wealthy facade she had spent decades cultivating was smashed to pieces on the floor, right alongside the champagne tower. Her sons were rolling in spilled alcohol and broken glass, destroying each other over a massive federal crime. And standing perfectly still amidst the absolute chaos was me. I stood there in my tailored emerald green dress, watching the destruction with a completely unbothered clinical expression. The sight of my calm composure completely broke Patricia's mind. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You did this!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw fury. "You destroyed my boys!" Patricia charged at me, her vintage beaded gown rustling violently. She closed the distance between us in seconds, pulling her arm back to deliver a vicious, open-handed slap across my face. She put her entire body weight into the swing, intending to wipe the victorious smile right off my mouth. I did not flinch. I did not step back. As her hand swung toward my cheek, I reached up with lightning speed and caught her wrist firmly in midair. I held Patricia's wrist firmly suspended in the air. The physical impact she intended to deliver was completely absorbed by my unwavering grip. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. She was a woman who had spent her entire life using emotional manipulation and social intimidation to control everyone around her. She was entirely unaccustomed to someone matching her with physical boundaries and absolute defiance. I did not squeeze her arm to cause pain, but I held it tight enough to let her know that her days of striking out at me were permanently over. I twisted her arm away, pushing her back just enough to break her physical space. She stumbled backward, her heavy, vintage beaded gown catching awkwardly on her expensive heels. She caught her balance and clutched her wrist against her chest, looking at me as if I had just transformed into a monster right before her eyes. The entire grand foyer, already paralyzed by the shattering of the massive champagne tower and the violent brawl between Gavin and Terence, focused entirely on our confrontation. Gavin and Terence had even stopped grappling on the floor, panting heavily as they looked up at us from the sticky marble tiles. "You are a monster," Patricia gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to maintain her manufactured dignity in front of her country club friends. "You come into this house and you destroy everything. You have completely ruined my family." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence in the room was so profound that every syllable I spoke landed like a hammer strike. "I did not ruin your family, Patricia," I replied, my tone completely clinical and devoid of any sympathy. I simply turned on the lights and let everyone see the rot that was already there. I reached into my emerald green designer clutch for the absolute final time tonight. I did not pull out a thick legal folder or a black envelope. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. It bore the official seal of the county clerk's office, and it was the culmination of my entire strategic response to their betrayal. I looked at Patricia, watching her frantic eyes dart toward the document in my hand. Her arrogant facade was slipping away, revealing the terrified, desperate woman underneath. "Do not worry, Patricia," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the whimpering of Madison, who was still curled on the floor. "I am sure tonight has been incredibly stressful for you. But after this federal raid is over, at least you have your beautiful, pristine colonial home to retreat to. You can go back to your quiet, wealthy neighborhood, invite your country club friends over for tea, and pretend none of this ever happened." I paused, letting the false comfort hang in the cold air for just a fraction of a second, before delivering the killing blow. "Oh, wait," I said, my smile returning sharper and colder than before. I extended my arm and thrust the single sheet of paper directly toward her chest. Patricia hesitated, her hand trembling violently, before she finally reached out and snatched it from my fingers. She looked down at the bold printed letters at the very top of the page. I watched her eyes scan the legal jargon, tracing the lines that legally dismantled her entire social identity. "What is this?" she demanded, though her voice had completely lost its venom. It was replaced by a hollow, creeping dread. "This is a public notice of default. My bank would never do this to me. I have an arrangement with the regional manager. Whoever bought this debt will have to deal with my lawyers in the morning." "Your bank was absolutely thrilled to get rid of you, Patricia," I interrupted smoothly, stepping closer to her. "You are exactly 120 days delinquent on your primary mortgage. You have taken out multiple high-interest loans just to maintain your fake wealthy lifestyle, and the regional bank was practically begging to sell your toxic defaulted debt to a private investment firm for a guaranteed lump sum of cash." Patricia shook her head frantically, holding the paper as if it were burning her hands. "They cannot do this," she stammered, looking around at her wealthy friends, who were now staring at her with blatant judgment and pity. Her financial ruin was fully exposed. "The anonymous corporation that purchased this debt cannot just take my house. I will fight them. They will not have to deal with your lawyers, Patricia," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Because the anonymous shell corporation in Delaware that purchased your debt entirely in cash last week does not negotiate with people who steal from my family." Patricia stared at me, the pieces slowly and agonizingly snapping together in her mind. Her mouth opened and closed, but she had absolutely no words left to defend herself. Her perfect, manicured world was entirely gone. "The limited liability company that bought your defaulted debt," I said, leaning in just slightly so she could see the absolute finality in my eyes. "That is me. I am your legal landlord, and I am your ultimate debt holder. And you have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property." I released Patricia's wrist, letting her arm drop limply to her side. The absolute finality of my words struck her harder than any physical blow ever could. Her knees buckled beneath the sheer weight of her heavy vintage beaded gown. She stumbled backward, her breathing rapidly deteriorating into short, jagged gasps as pure panic completely overtook her nervous system. She collapsed heavily onto a luxurious white velvet sofa situated near the base of the grand staircase. She pressed both hands firmly to her chest, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of her situation permanently set in. She was not just losing her precious, pristine colonial house, she was losing her entire fabricated identity. The wealthy country club friends she had spent decades desperately trying to impress were no longer looking at her with admiration. They were looking at her with absolute disgust and sheer horror. Several of them were already whispering frantically among themselves, pulling their expensive designer coats tight and moving quickly toward the front doors to escape the impending scandal. They were abandoning her exactly as she had always abandoned anyone who no longer served her selfish social needs. She reached a shaking hand out toward a passing friend, but the woman simply turned her head away and hurried out into the cold night. A few feet away, Madison was entirely inconsolable. She was sitting right in the middle of the massive puddle of vintage champagne, completely disregarding the dangerously sharp pieces of shattered crystal scattered all around her. Her expensive custom silk dress was soaked and ruined, but she did not even seem to notice. She hugged her knees tightly to her chest, sobbing so hard that her entire body violently shook. Her perfect blonde hair was plastered to her wet, tear-stained face in tangled, unkempt strands. She kept holding up her left hand, staring desperately at the massive 4-carat diamond ring, as if the jewelry could somehow magically fix her rapidly crumbling world. She wailed loudly, crying out that this was supposed to be her perfect night, and that she absolutely could not go back to being broke and ordinary. Terence was nowhere near her. He was leaning heavily against the mahogany banister, nursing a severely bruised jaw, and looking around frantically for an escape route that no longer existed. He had entirely abandoned his protective, loving fiancé persona the very moment his own personal freedom was threatened. Then I heard the sickening sound of crunching glass. Gavin was literally crawling across the slippery marble floor toward me. His expensive tailored suit was deeply stained with spilled champagne and torn at the shoulder from his violent, desperate brawl with Terence. A thin, steady stream of dark blood trickled down from a deep, jagged split in his lower lip. He used the edge of a nearby overturned catering table to pull himself up onto his knees. He did not look anything like the arrogant patriarch who had confidently demanded I buy a $5,000 espresso machine just hours earlier. He looked exactly like a terrified, completely broken child. "Nadine, please," Gavin begged, his voice cracking horribly with raw desperation. He reached out with trembling, bloody hands, trying to desperately grasp the hem of my tailored emerald green dress. I took a deliberate, sharp step backward, absolutely refusing to let him touch me. "Please, you have to stop this. I am so incredibly sorry. I was stupid and I made a massive, terrible mistake. My mother and Terence manipulated me. They told me it was a guaranteed investment and that I was doing the right thing for the future of our family. You know I am not a real criminal, Nadine. Please just call Corinne and tell her to withdraw the civil lawsuit. We can immediately sell this mansion and pay back the entire line of credit. I will do whatever you want. I will go to intensive counseling. Just please take me back and call off the ruthless lawyers. Do not let them send me to federal prison." I looked down at the pathetic man I had once genuinely promised to spend the rest of my life with. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of affection or pity, but I found absolutely nothing. The space where my love and respect for him used to reside was completely hollowed out. I did not even feel anger anymore. I only felt a cold, absolute clinical certainty. "You were not manipulated, Gavin," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You made a conscious, selfish choice to deliberately forge my signature. You made a conscious choice to steal my money so you could feel powerful and important. You sat smugly at my dining table and watched your family blatantly insult me while knowing full well you had already robbed me blind. You arrogantly thought my silence was weakness. You genuinely thought you could just take whatever you wanted, and I would simply fall in line like an obedient servant." He sobbed loudly, burying his bleeding face in his shaking hands. "You wanted my money so badly, Gavin," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "Now you have all the consequences that come with it." He collapsed forward onto his hands, crying hysterically into the ruined, spilled champagne. I turned my back on him. The grand foyer was almost completely empty now, as the last of the wealthy investors eagerly fled the active crime scene. And then, cutting sharply through the cool night air and the pathetic sounds of my ruined family weeping, I heard it. Sirens echoed in the distance, getting louder and closer with every single passing second. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant echo into a deafening roar that completely swallowed the quiet suburban street. Within seconds, the massive arched windows of the grand foyer were illuminated by the frantic strobing of red and blue emergency lights. The harsh colors bounced off the pristine marble floors and the shattered crystal champagne glasses, creating a dizzying, chaotic disco of impending justice. Terence snapped his head toward the front doors, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a trapped animal. The realization hit him like a freight train. These were not local police responding to a noise complaint. This was a targeted federal raid. He completely abandoned his carefully crafted persona of the brilliant tech entrepreneur. He did not check on Madison, who was still sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne, and he did not look back at the ruined family he had manipulated. Terrence scrambled to his feet, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the wet marble, and sprinted desperately toward the back hallway leading to the rear patio. He thought he could slip out through the back garden and disappear into the neighboring golf course under the cover of darkness. He had absolutely no idea that his escape routes had been entirely cut off hours ago. I had not just handed the federal indictment to him for dramatic effect. When Harrison Cole intercepted the sealed arrest warrants earlier that afternoon, I made a highly specific phone call to the lead investigator at the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I provided them with the exact address of the engagement party, a detailed guest list, and a severe warning that Terrence was an extreme flight risk, who likely had access to untraceable offshore cryptocurrency accounts. I explicitly told the federal agents that if they wanted their man, they needed to secure the entire perimeter of the property before even thinking about knocking on the front door. The heavy custom mahogany front doors suddenly and violently shuddered. A booming, authoritative voice echoed from the front porch, demanding immediate entry. Federal agents opened the door. Nobody inside the house moved. Gavin was still paralyzed on the floor, clutching his bleeding lip and staring blankly at the wood. Patricia was frozen on the white velvet sofa, her mouth hanging open in silent, absolute horror. Madison just screamed, covering her ears as if blocking the sound would somehow make the reality disappear. I calmly took a step back, moving safely out of the direct line of the entrance. 3 seconds later, the heavy doors were forcefully breached, swinging inward with a massive, deafening crash that rattled the framed artwork on the walls. Over a dozen armed law enforcement officers swarmed into the grand foyer. They were not standard beat cops. They wore heavy tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters reading FBI and CID. Their heavy boots crunched loudly over the shattered crystal as they rapidly spread out to secure the massive room. "Secure the perimeter," a lead agent barked, shining a blinding tactical flashlight right across the bewildered faces of the remaining country club guests and the terrified family members. "Nobody moves. Keep your hands where we can easily see them." Madison shrieked in absolute terror, throwing her hands over her head and curling into a tight ball on the wet, sticky floor. Patricia pressed herself deep into the cushions of the velvet sofa, completely speechless, as heavily armed federal agents marched right past her expensive vintage gown. Gavin remained on his knees, slowly raising his trembling, bloody hands into the air, completely broken and defeated. Then the sound of a violent physical struggle echoed from the dark back hallway. Shouts of "stop resisting and get on the ground" rang out from the direction of the luxury kitchen. Terrence had not even made it to the patio doors. 2 massive federal agents dragged him forcefully back out into the bright, glaring light of the grand foyer. He was kicking and thrashing wildly, his custom-tailored suit jacket ripped at the shoulder seam and his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his neck. "Let go of me!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with desperate panic. "I know my rights. I want my lawyer. You cannot do this. This is my house." "It is not your house anymore, Terrence," the lead agent replied, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering." The agents shoved Terrence roughly against the pristine white marble wall right next to the ruins of the Champagne Tower. They grabbed his wrists, pulling his arms forcefully and painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed sharply through the silent room. The few remaining wealthy investors who had stayed behind to demand their money back stood frozen in the corners of the room. They watched in absolute stunned silence as the brilliant tech visionary they had blindly trusted was physically subdued and utterly humiliated. Terrence pressed his bruised cheek against the cold marble wall, breathing heavily in absolute defeat as the federal agent began to read him his rights in front of his entire ruined empire. As the lead agent finished reading Terrence his rights, the harsh reality of the situation finally swept across the rest of the room. Two other heavily armed federal agents pivoted away from the shattered champagne tower and walked purposefully toward the center of the grand foyer. Their heavy boots crunched over the broken glass as they approached Gavin. He was still kneeling on the sticky marble floor, clutching his bleeding lip and staring blankly ahead. "Are you Gavin?" The taller of the two agents asked, his voice projecting absolute authority. Gavin slowly looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He gave a weak, pathetic nod. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the word. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back," the agent ordered, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are being placed under arrest." Gavin shrank back, completely paralyzed by fear. "Arrested?" he stammered. "No, you do not understand. I am not a part of Terrence's business. I just invested some money. I am a real estate agent. I do not have anything to do with his tax evasion." The federal agent did not offer an ounce of sympathy. "You are not being arrested for tax evasion," Gavin, the agent, replied sharply, "because the $400,000 home equity line of credit you fraudulently authorized was processed through a federally insured banking institution, and the electronic funds were wired across state lines to purchase this property. Your crimes fall entirely under federal jurisdiction. You are being charged with severe wire fraud and aggravated identity theft." "Now stand up." Gavin completely broke down. The arrogant man who had proudly demanded I buy a $5,000 espresso machine just hours ago began sobbing like a terrified child. Tears and snot streamed down his face, mixing with the blood from his split lip. He refused to stand, so the two agents forcefully grabbed him by his arms and hauled him up to his feet. "Please," Gavin wailed, his voice cracking hysterically as they twisted his arms behind his back. "Please do not do this. It is my wife's money. We are married. I am allowed to use it. Nadine, tell them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, Nadine, do not let them take me." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room, answering his desperate pleas. The sound snapped Patricia out of her catatonic state. She leaped off the white velvet sofa, her vintage beaded gown rustling wildly. Her mind had completely fractured under the weight of the absolute destruction of her social empire. She lunged toward the federal agents, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice completely delusional and frantic. "You are taking the wrong person. Do you not see what is happening here?" She set them up. She is a vindictive corporate psycho who plotted this entire thing to steal my house and ruin my beautiful family. Arrest her. Put those handcuffs on her right now. One of the federal agents stepped firmly between Patricia and Gavin, raising a heavy hand to halt her advance. "Ma'am, step back immediately," the agent warned, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "If you interfere with a federal arrest, I will place you in handcuffs for obstruction of justice. Step back right now." Patricia froze, her face contorted in a mask of sheer disbelief and pure hatred. She stood there trembling helplessly as the federal agents began marching her golden child and her supposedly brilliant son-in-law toward the shattered front doors. I did not stay to watch them get loaded into the back of the armored vehicles. I had seen exactly what I came to see. I reached into my emerald green clutch and pulled out my phone. My scheduled luxury ride service was waiting just outside the main gates. I smoothed the front of my tailored silk dress, ensuring not a single drop of spilled champagne had touched the fabric. I stepped carefully over the jagged pieces of broken crystal, bypassing Madison, who was still curled into a tight sobbing ball on the floor. I walked right past Patricia, who glared at me with hollow, empty eyes. Nadine, Gavin screamed over his shoulder as the agents pushed him out onto the front porch. "Nadine, please." I did not even turn my head. I walked out the massive front doors and stepped into the crisp, cold November night. The air tasted incredibly fresh. I walked past the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles and approached the sleek black car waiting at the end of the circular driveway. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door for me. "How was the party, Mom?" he asked politely as I slid into the comfortable leather seat. I looked out the window, watching the federal agents press Gavin against the hood of a squad car. "It was unforgettable," I replied, completely relaxed. The driver closed the door, shutting out the noise of the sirens and the screaming. The car pulled smoothly out of the sprawling suburban driveway, turning onto the dark, quiet street. I leaned back in my seat, looking straight ahead, and drove away into the night without ever looking back. 6 months passed in the blink of an eye. The chaotic memory of the flashing police lights in the suburban driveway felt like a lifetime ago. I was sitting in a sleek glass-walled boardroom high above the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. The morning sunlight poured across the polished mahogany table, illuminating the thick stacks of legal binders meticulously organized by my attorney, Corinne. I took a sip of my black coffee, feeling a profound sense of peace. I had spent the last half-year completely rebuilding my life, free from the parasitic drain of my former in-laws. But today was not about my future. Today was about finalizing the absolute destruction of Gavin's past. The heavy glass door swung open, and Gavin walked into the room accompanied by a tired-looking public defender. The federal government had immediately frozen all of Gavin's bank accounts following his arrest, and with Terrence's Ponzi scheme entirely collapsed, there was absolutely no money left to hire a high-powered private defense attorney. Gavin looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant charm and the expensive tailored suits were entirely gone. He was wearing an ill-fitting gray suit that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin. His face was gaunt, his shoulders were slumped, and he refused to make eye contact with me as he pulled out a chair and sat across the massive table. His public defender, a man who looked like he had not slept in 3 days, cleared his throat and opened a thin manila folder. He looked across the table at Corinne and attempted to initiate a desperate negotiation. He explained that Gavin was willing to sign the divorce papers uncontested and surrender his remaining meager personal assets if I agreed to formally drop my civil lawsuit for the $400,000 restitution. The public defender argued that Gavin was a first-time offender who had been deeply manipulated by his brother-in-law, and that facing both federal criminal charges and a massive civil judgment would permanently ruin his life and entirely prevent his rehabilitation. Corinne did not even bother to open her meticulously organized binders. She simply folded her hands on the mahogany table and looked at the public defender with a predatory clinical smile. She calmly explained that my civil lawsuit was absolutely not up for negotiation. She pointed out that Gavin did not just make a bad investment. He actively committed identity theft and federal bank fraud to steal from his own wife. Corinne stated that we would not withdraw a single legal filing, and we would aggressively pursue the civil judgment, garnishing any future wages Gavin might ever earn after his release. She also casually mentioned that the State Real Estate Commission had already permanently revoked his broker's license. The public defender sighed heavily, recognizing a completely unwinnable battle, and closed his thin folder. The mediation lasted less than 15 minutes. Gavin sat in absolute silence, staring down at his trembling hands. When the brief meeting concluded, he finally looked up at me. His eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow that might have worked on me a year ago. Now it just looked pathetic. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I stood up, smoothed my tailored suit jacket, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving him to face the crushing weight of the federal justice system entirely alone. 2 weeks later, I sat in the hard wooden gallery benches of the United States District Court. The courtroom was vast and intimidating, characterized by dark wood paneling and the solemn authority of the federal judge presiding over the bench. Gavin stood before the judge, flanked by his exhausted public defender. He was wearing a standard-issue tan federal jumpsuit, his wrists handcuffed in front of him. The federal prosecutor had laid out an ironclad case detailing the forged home equity line of credit, the interstate wire transfers, and the blatant identity theft. Because Gavin had signed the liability trap I drafted, he could not deflect any blame onto Terrence. He was completely and solely responsible for his own fraudulent actions. The federal judge looked down at Gavin over the rim of his reading glasses. He spoke with a stern, unwavering voice, admonishing Gavin for his severe breach of trust and his blatant disregard for the financial security of his spouse. The judge noted that while Gavin had no prior criminal record, the sheer magnitude of the financial crime and the deliberate, calculated nature of the forgery demanded a strict penalty under federal sentencing guidelines. The justice system could not simply overlook such a massive theft. The heavy wooden gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack. The judge sentenced Gavin to 36 months in a federal correctional institution, followed by 5 years of supervised release and a strict order to pay full mandatory financial restitution. Gavin dropped his head, letting out a quiet, muffled sob as the federal marshals stepped forward to escort him away. I sat perfectly still in the gallery, watching the heavy wooden doors close behind him. The man who had tried to steal my future was now officially a federal inmate. The legal battle was over, and I had won completely. The fallout of the federal raid did not stay quietly contained within the affluent suburban community. By the following Monday morning, the face of the self-proclaimed tech visionary was plastered across every major national news network. Terrence Innovations was publicly exposed as one of the most brazen and destructive Ponzi schemes in recent state history. Financial journalists tore his fake business model to absolute shreds on live television, detailing exactly how he preyed on elderly country club investors and used their life savings to finance his luxury cars and custom-tailored suits. The scale of the fraud was staggering, reaching into the tens of millions of dollars. Interviews with ruined investors played on a continuous loop, showcasing the devastating human cost of his arrogant greed. As the walls of his jail cell closed in, Terrence did exactly what cowards always do when they are cornered. He turned on the only person left to blame. During his initial federal arraignment, his high-priced defense attorney attempted a desperate and calculated legal maneuver. They presented the revised tax affidavit that Gavin had so foolishly signed the night before the party. Terrence's lawyer stood before the judge and argued that Gavin was the true financial mastermind, holding the sole individual guarantor document as concrete proof that Gavin controlled the corporate debt and directed the illegal cash flow. Terrence actually tried to paint himself as an innocent visionary who was manipulated by a greedy real estate agent. Gavin was sitting at the defense table in his own prison uniform when his brother-in-law launched the ultimate betrayal. He watched in absolute horror as the man he had committed identity theft for the man he had ruined his marriage for casually tried to hand him a multi-decade prison sentence. But federal prosecutors are not easily fooled by cheap courtroom theatrics. They possessed the forensic accounting data I had provided, which traced every single fraudulent wire transfer and fake dividend payment directly back to Terrence's personal devices. While Gavin's signature legally anchored him to the massive financial debt and firmly secured his 3-year prison sentence for the home equity forgery, it did not absolve Terrence of orchestrating the overarching Ponzi scheme. The judge saw right through the pathetic blame game. The hammer of justice swung much harder for the architect of the fraud. Terrence was completely stripped of his arrogant persona and convicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and running an illegal securities operation. The judge handed him a crushing sentence of 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The smooth-talking grifter who had mocked my corporate job at the Thanksgiving table was now just a number in the federal prison system, facing a decade and a half behind thick concrete walls. With Terrence locked away and Gavin serving his own sentence, the false empire they had built completely evaporated into thin air. The federal government moved swiftly and without mercy. They immediately seized the 5-bedroom suburban mansion, auctioning off the luxury cars, the designer furniture, and every single asset tied to the stolen funds. Madison was abruptly thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. The golden child who had spent her entire life coasting on her looks and relying on the financial theft of the men around her was suddenly forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. She desperately tried to rely on her wealthy social circle. But the moment the federal agents raided the engagement party, her country club friends permanently blocked her phone number. Nobody wanted to be associated with the fiancé of a convicted federal fraudster. She had no college degree, no marketable skills, and a resume consisting entirely of fake administrative roles at Terrence's non-existent company. She was entirely unemployable. Even Patricia could not offer her a safe haven. My mother-in-law was too busy packing her own belongings into cheap garbage bags, preparing for the impending foreclosure eviction I had legally initiated. With nowhere left to turn and her bank accounts entirely frozen by the federal authorities, Madison packed her few remaining items into a cheap duffel bag. Late one evening, she walked into a dimly lit pawn shop on the industrial edge of the city. The bell above the door chimed a depressing note as she approached the scuffed glass counter. Her hands shook violently as she pulled the massive 4-carat diamond ring from her finger. The ring she had so proudly flaunted at the party, the ultimate symbol of her stolen wealth, was now her only remaining lifeline. The pawnbroker recognized her desperate situation immediately and offered her a pathetic fraction of its actual value. With tears streaming down her ruined makeup, Madison handed over the diamond, accepted the small wad of crumpled cash, and walked out into the pouring rain to rent a cheap roadside motel room. The legal wheels of foreclosure turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Over the last 6 months, while Gavin and Terrence faced their federal criminal trials, I let my corporate lawyers handle Patricia's defaulted mortgage. The 48-hour notice I gave her at the engagement party was just the beginning of a relentless legal siege. She fought back, of course, hiring cheap attorneys with whatever credit she had left, but you cannot fight simple math. The massive debt was entirely real, and my anonymous Delaware shell company owned it completely. The judge finalized the foreclosure without hesitation and issued a hard eviction date. Today was that day. I pulled my car up to the pristine colonial house, parking right behind 2 marked sheriff's department cruisers. It was a beautiful, crisp Tuesday morning. It was perfect weather for a public spectacle. Patricia's neighborhood was the kind of affluent place where everyone knew everyone's business, and where appearances were the absolute currency of life. I stepped out of my car just as the heavy custom front door swung open. Patricia stood in the doorway, physically blocking the path of the 2 uniformed deputies. She was wearing a silk morning robe and her hair was perfectly styled as if she was expecting a lifestyle magazine photographer instead of local law enforcement. She was screaming at them, demanding they leave her property immediately and insisting that there had been a terrible administrative mistake. She actually believed her own arrogant delusions. She truly thought her decades of country club status somehow made her immune to the brutal reality of a court-ordered eviction. I walked slowly up the paved walkway, my heels clicking sharply against the expensive stone. When Patricia saw me, her face contorted with a sickening mixture of absolute rage and helpless terror. She tried to lunge past the deputies, but one of them firmly held out a muscular arm, keeping her physically restrained. "You cannot do this to me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the quiet suburban street. "I built this house. I raised my entire family here. You are a heartless monster." I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with a completely blank clinical expression. "You did not build this house, Patricia," I replied smoothly. "You leveraged it to death to buy designer clothes and country club lunches you absolutely could not afford. I bought the debt you ignored. This is my property now, and your tenancy is officially terminated." The deputies did not wait for her to argue. They presented the signed court order and informed her that she had exactly 10 minutes to gather her immediate personal necessities before the physical removal began. Patricia absolutely refused to move. She stood there crying hysterically and threatening to call the city mayor. The deputies simply ignored her threats and gave a sharp nod to the professional eviction crew waiting in a massive box truck parked directly across the street. What followed was the absolute total dismantling of Patricia's fabricated life. The crew worked with ruthless efficiency. They marched into the house and began carrying out her heavy antique furniture, her crystal vases, and her vintage beaded gowns, placing them directly onto the public curb. Patricia sobbed uncontrollably on the front lawn as a worker unceremoniously dropped a massive stack of her expensive designer leather handbags right next to a pile of rusty gardening tools. The loud commotion drew a massive crowd. Doors opened up and down the exclusive street. Her wealthy neighbors, the very people she had spent decades desperately trying to impress and dominate, stepped out onto their manicured lawns to watch the spectacle unfold. They whispered to each other, pointing at the embarrassing mountain of seized belongings piling up on the dirty sidewalk. Patricia tried to hide her face behind her shaking hands, completely shattered by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch of an affluent suburban dynasty. She was just another broke, evicted tenant sitting on the curb. Once the house was entirely cleared of her presence and the new heavy brass locks were installed, the deputies escorted Patricia off the premises for good. I did not say a single word of goodbye to her. I simply walked inside my newly acquired asset. The house was empty and echoing, stripped of all its pretentious decorations. It was a massive piece of prime real estate in a highly coveted school district, and I was ready to cash in. I did not waste a single day. I immediately hired a premier staging company to modernize the outdated interior and a top-tier real estate agency to list the property. Because I had purchased the defaulted mortgage from the regional bank at a massive cash discount, my profit margin was already substantial. We listed the colonial house in a fiercely competitive market. Within 48 hours, a massive bidding war erupted among young corporate executives desperate to move into the exclusive neighborhood. I accepted an all-cash offer that was hundreds of thousands of dollars above the original debt I had purchased. The closing was incredibly fast and entirely seamless. The massive wire transfer hit my high-yield savings account, replacing the money Gavin had originally stolen and adding a staggering profit right on top of it. Patricia's lifelong obsession with status and material wealth had ultimately financed my complete financial independence. The dust had completely settled on the financial battlefield. The massive profit from the sale of Patricia's colonial house had been securely diversified into my investment portfolio. I was sitting at the custom glass desk in my new temporary high-rise apartment, enjoying a rare, quiet Saturday morning. I poured myself a cup of premium dark roast coffee, a quiet, ironic nod to the ridiculous $5,000 espresso machine that the authorities had seized and auctioned off months ago. The morning sun illuminated the city skyline, spreading a warm golden glow across my living room. I felt lighter than I had in years. The suffocating weight of my former in-laws was entirely gone. My phone vibrated softly on the glass surface. I glanced at the screen expecting an update from my corporate team, or perhaps a message from Corinne regarding the finalization of the divorce decree. Instead, the notification displayed a long paragraph from an unsaved number. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. The tone was frantic, desperate, and laced with heavy grammatical errors. It did not take long to figure out who was contacting me. "Nadine, please do not delete this." Madison wrote her text message, reading like a panicked, breathless plea. "I had to buy a cheap prepaid phone just to reach you. Everything is completely falling apart. Terrence's lawyers drained whatever cash we had left before they dropped his case. We could not afford the roadside motel anymore. Mom and I had to move into a rundown trailer park on the edge of the county. It is awful here, Nadine. The heating barely works and the neighbors are terrifying. But that is not even the worst part." I took a slow sip of my coffee, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady. I read the next paragraph of her message with the same clinical detachment I used to analyze quarterly hospital budgets. "Mom is really sick," Madison continued. The stress of the eviction and losing all her country club friends completely broke her. Her blood pressure is dangerously high and she is having severe heart palpitations. She needs her expensive prescription medications, and the state health insurance has not kicked in yet. Nobody will help us. I tried getting a job at a retail store, but the pay is basically nothing, and I cannot keep up with the lot rent and the medical bills. I know you hate us, and I know we made terrible mistakes. But she is still family. She is Gavin's mother. Please, Nadine, we are begging you for a small loan, just enough to get her medication and keep the heat on this month. I promise I will pay you back eventually. Have some human decency. I set my coffee mug down on the desk and stared at the glowing screen. Madison was actually trying to weaponize the concept of family against me. She was trying to use guilt to extract money from the very woman her family had conspired to rob. The sheer unadulterated audacity was almost impressive. She wanted me to feel sorry for the woman who had demanded I cater a party for 100 people to apologize for not supporting a federal Ponzi scheme. She wanted me to pity the girl who had flashed a 4-carat diamond ring, bought with my stolen home equity, and mocked my corporate career. A year ago, the old me might have felt a brief, agonizing pang of guilt. The old me might have wired them $1,000 just to ease my own conscience. But the old me died the night I discovered the unauthorized cashier's check. I looked at the message, analyzing it as a pure data point. Madison was not asking for a loan. She was asking for a permanent handout because she possessed absolutely no survival skills of her own. If I sent her money today, she would inevitably be back next month with another sob story and another manufactured emergency. They were a financial black hole, and I absolutely refused to be pulled back into their gravitational orbit. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph explaining my anger. I did not hurl insults or point out the deep irony of her current living situation. I kept my response razor-sharp, incredibly precise, and absolutely final. I tapped the screen, bringing up the keyboard. I crunch numbers for a living. I typed, my fingers moving swiftly and deliberately over the digital keys. And my calculations show you are no longer my problem. I hit send. I watched the small indicator confirm that the message had been successfully delivered to her prepaid phone. I did not wait for a reply. I did not want to see her pathetic excuses or her inevitable transition from begging to bitter, angry insults. I immediately tapped the information icon at the top of the screen, selected block caller, and confirmed the permanent restriction. I set the phone face down on the glass desk. The severance was completely absolute. There were no lingering loose ends, no lingering guilt, and absolutely no more polite conversations. I picked up my coffee mug, leaned back in my comfortable chair, and watched the morning traffic move silently through the city streets far below. I was finally entirely free. The weeks that followed my final message to Madison were characterized by a profound and beautiful silence. For the first 3 years of my marriage, my daily life had been a constant barrage of demanding text messages, passive-aggressive phone calls, and the exhausting effort of managing my husband's fragile ego. Now my phone only rang when I wanted it to. I had successfully excised the parasitic tumor that was my former family, and the resulting space in my life quickly filled with extraordinary professional momentum. I channeled every ounce of my focus and analytical precision into my work at the healthcare analytics firm. My ability to remain completely unbothered under extreme pressure had not gone unnoticed by the hospital board of directors. They had watched me navigate a massive corporate data migration during the exact same quarter I was quietly dismantling a federal Ponzi scheme and divorcing my fraudulent husband. I never missed a single deadline. I never let my personal life bleed into my professional obligations. Late one Friday afternoon, the chief executive officer called me into his top-floor office. There were no dramatic negotiations or corporate games. He simply slid a sleek leather portfolio across his mahogany desk. Inside was a newly drafted executive contract. They were officially promoting me to the C-suite. I was named the new chief data officer, making me one of the youngest and highest-paid female executives in the entire corporate healthcare network. I signed the contract with the exact same silver pen I had used to sign my divorce papers. But this time, the ink represented absolute limitless potential instead of a necessary severing. My new compensation package included massive stock options and a substantial base salary increase. But the truth was, I barely even needed the corporate paycheck anymore. The financial windfall from my strategic legal maneuvers had permanently elevated my wealth. The restitution garnishments from Gavin's frozen accounts, the complete retention of my premarital assets through Corinne's ironclad divorce decree, and the staggering cash profit from the brutal foreclosure sale of Patricia's beloved colonial house had completely transformed my portfolio. I was no longer just a high-earning professional. I was entirely independently wealthy. With my new promotion secured and my bank accounts overflowing, I decided it was time to physically manifest my absolute independence. I had sold the original marital home, the one Gavin had fraudulently leveraged the moment the divorce was finalized. I wanted absolutely nothing tying me to the memory of his betrayal. Instead, I looked to the sky. I hired an exclusive private real estate broker and gave him a very specific set of requirements. I did not want a sprawling suburban mansion with manicured lawns and nosy country club neighbors. I wanted a fortress of glass and steel. Within a week, I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a breathtaking two-story penthouse situated at the very top of a sleek, modern high-rise in the absolute center of the downtown financial district. The moment I stepped out of the private elevator and into the massive, open-concept living space, I knew I was home. The penthouse featured soaring 20-foot ceilings and wrap-around floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire city skyline. The floors were polished dark hardwood, and the kitchen was a masterpiece of black marble and brushed steel. It was sharp, modern, and entirely uncompromising. It looked exactly like the woman I had become. I did not bother applying for a mortgage. I did not need to negotiate an interest rate or wait for a bank to approve my financial standing. I wired the entire purchase price directly from my high-yield savings account, buying the multi-million-dollar penthouse entirely in cash. Closing day was quiet and completely seamless. I spent the next month furnishing the space to my exact specifications. I chose deep jewel tones, velvet textures, and sleek modern art. There were no cheap pastel colors or floral patterns that Patricia would have demanded. Every single item in the penthouse was chosen solely because it pleased me. The first night I spent in my new home was a quiet triumph. I walked through the massive living room, my bare feet silent against the dark hardwood floors. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and walked over to the massive glass window. I looked out over the glittering skyline and thought back to that chaotic Thanksgiving dinner. I remembered the smug look on Terrence's face and the arrogant demands of my former mother-in-law. They had genuinely believed they held all the power because they operated on lies and manipulation. But lies are fragile, and manipulation shatters the moment it hits the solid brick wall of reality. From up here, the cars looked like tiny, insignificant ants, and the noise of the busy streets was completely muted by the thick, soundproof glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, relishing the absolute silence. I had built my own empire entirely from scratch, defended it against those who tried to tear it down, and emerged completely victorious. The morning after I moved into the penthouse, I woke up long before the sun even crested the horizon. I walked into my sleek black marble kitchen and turned on the new espresso machine. The rich, dark aroma of premium roasted coffee beans filled the quiet, immaculate space. I poured the steaming liquid into a small ceramic cup and walked straight out onto the expansive glass balcony. The massive city of Atlanta was just beginning to wake up far below me. The morning air was sharp and cold against my skin, but I felt absolutely invulnerable. I leaned my forearms against the high glass railing and watched the eastern sky slowly transition from a deep bruised purple into a brilliant, vibrant gold. The sounds of morning traffic were a faint whisper from this incredible height. It was genuinely hard to comprehend just how drastically my reality had transformed in less than a single calendar year. 12 months ago, I was sitting at a crowded Thanksgiving table listening to a family of arrogant grifters tear down my professional accomplishments while they secretly drained my savings. I was unknowingly trapped in a marriage that was built entirely on blatant financial exploitation and relentless emotional manipulation. Gavin had looked at me and seen nothing but a limitless automated teller machine. Patricia had looked at me and seen a convenient corporate servant meant to unconditionally fund her desperate country club lifestyle. Madison and Terrence had looked at me and seen a naive stepping stone designed to finance their massive fraudulent tech empire. They all made the exact same fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because I was a polite woman who valued household peace, I fundamentally lacked the capacity for absolute legal warfare. They mistook my silence for weakness and my income for their inheritance. But you cannot steal the crown from the woman who built the kingdom. I did not inherit my wealth. I did not marry into my financial success. I mathematically engineered it. Every single dollar I possessed was the direct, tangible result of my own intellect and my own relentless corporate work ethic. When Gavin selfishly forged my electronic signature, he thought he was just moving abstract numbers on a digital banking screen. He completely failed to realize that he was actively dismantling the very foundation that kept his entire parasitic family afloat. The contrast between my current reality and their ultimate fate is incredibly stark and permanent. Today, Gavin wakes up on a thin, rigid mattress in a federal correctional facility, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his manufactured pride. Terrence is permanently locked away in a high-security penitentiary, facing another 14 years of absolute unglamorous isolation. Patricia is permanently banished from the wealthy, affluent suburbs she worshipped, forced to live out her remaining days in complete humiliating obscurity. And Madison is finally learning what it actually means to survive in the real world without a stolen credit card to catch her when she inevitably falls. I did not have to maliciously destroy them. I simply stepped out of the way, removed my financial protection, and let the heavy, crushing consequences of their own toxic greed bury them entirely. As I took another slow sip of my espresso, looking out over the glittering, endless city skyline, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of gratitude. The profound betrayal I experienced could have easily broken my spirit. It could have left me permanently bitter, distrustful, and financially devastated. Instead, it became the ultimate powerful catalyst for my complete personal liberation. I surgically severed the dead branches of my life and allowed the roots of my own fierce independence to grow deeper and stronger than ever before. I am no longer playing a submissive supporting role in someone else's carefully manufactured delusion. I am the sole, unapologetic author of my own extraordinary future. I will never again allow anyone to dictate my worth or demand my resources as if they were entitled to the fruits of my endless labor. For anyone watching who is shrinking themselves to make a toxic partner or an entitled family feel comfortable, it is time to stop immediately. Your hard-earned success is absolutely not a communal asset meant to be violently drained by those who adamantly refuse to build their own lives. Have you ever had to cut the dead weight out of your life to finally fly? Tell me in the comments. I want to read your stories of survival and absolute triumph. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of taking back your power. Share this video with anyone who needs a harsh, necessary reminder of their own incredible self-worth. And remember, never apologize for what you have earned. The story of Nadine's calculated dismantling of her toxic in-laws offers a masterclass in absolute self-preservation. The most profound lesson woven throughout her journey is that silence in the face of disrespect is inevitably mistaken for weakness, and your hard-earned success is never a communal asset for those who continuously undermine you. For years, Nadine endured the condescension of her mother-in-law and the entitled behavior of her husband, Gavin. Society often pressures individuals, especially women, to keep the peace, to absorb passive-aggressive insults, and to play a submissive role for the sake of family harmony. However, as the story illustrates, this forced compliance only emboldens abusers. Gavin and his family genuinely believe that because Nadine chose not to engage in petty arguments, she fundamentally lacked the strength to fight back. They viewed her financial stability not as a boundary to be respected, but as a resource to be freely exploited. The turning point was not a dramatic emotional explosion, but a clinical realization of her own undeniable worth. Nadine teaches us that the ultimate response to betrayal is not screaming or seeking validation from those entirely incapable of giving it. Instead, it is the quiet, methodical execution of absolute boundaries. When we realize that our value does not depend on the conditional approval of toxic people, we instantly reclaim our power. Nadine stopped being the financial lifeboat for a sinking family and instead chose to rescue herself. We must learn to let those who actively manipulate us face the natural, devastating consequences of their own actions. Ultimately, taking back your power requires the courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Take a moment today to audit your own relationships, firmly establish your absolute boundaries, and share this message with someone who needs the courage to finally choose themselves.